Hello, welcome to SuperReturn Asia 2019. I'm Sarah Clark, coming to you from Hong Kong, and I'm joined by David Rennie, who's the Beijing Bureau Chief for The Economist. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Lots of big questions we want to ask you. Let's start with China. Should we be worried about China? Should the world be worried about China?
Look, I think China is on a very natural, understandable trajectory, which is that China wants to be so large and so powerful and so strong sometime fairly soon that no other country on the face of the earth gets to tell China what to do. That's a completely natural and understandable ambition, but the fact that China has this one-party political system and has taken a very illiberal turn in the last few years means, I think, that across particularly Western capitals and above all in Washington DC, that the idea of that China that gets to do what it likes and that no one can tell no to, that looks like a much more scary prospect than it did. And the other big change is that, 20 years ago, when China joined, for example, the World Trade Organization, you had people like President Bill Clinton making a fairly explicit promise that integrating China into the global economy would somehow kind of infect China with ideas of freedom and liberalism and maybe even one day democracy. So that it wasn't just about making money, that we were actually trying to sort of change China's political system cleverly from within. And what we have seen instead is that politically China has not opened at all. It's gone the other way. It's become much, much more repressive. And also that China believes it can run a state-led version of capitalism with a lot of industrial policy and a lot of government intervention, and that it can rise nonetheless. So that's a gigantic challenge on so many fronts. It's not just a very large country, it's not just a country with a very clear ambition about what it wants to go, but it's getting there in ways that make all of those cozy assumptions the West used to have look very foolish and naive.
So is it the most comprehensive threat ever to face the United States, as Donald Trump would suggest?
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, look, China is America and really the West's largest strategic rival. It's the largest economic rival. And it's also, for many of them, the largest trade partner. We've never had that before. If you think back to the 1980s, if you were an American leader looking at the world, your biggest economic threat was Japan, rising so fast. But Japan was a dependent military ally. It did what it was told in strategic terms. And then your big geopolitical rival was the Soviet Union. But America did hardly any trade with the Soviet Union. I looked up the numbers recently. In 1987, total US trade with the Soviet Union was $2 billion in 1 year. In last year, total US-China trade was $2 billion a day. And it's the same level of ideological threat and strategic threat that the Soviet Union liked to be. So, if you want to simplify, it's kind of the Japan and the Soviet Union rolled into one.
So who will win the US-China trade war, and where we are now?
So, it depends on your definition of winning, and it depends on when it ends. I think that we could see some sort of a deal linked to the 2020 American elections. Certainly in Beijing, if you had to ask the Chinese side what their hope is, it's that they can do a very political deal that doesn't really involve painful structural concessions on the Chinese side, that they don't really have to change their ways when it comes to their style of capitalism and globalization. But they can just buy some stuff. Essentially they can buy, a bunch of soybeans and American products, and that will be enough to get Donald Trump re-elected. That sort of deal, I think, could happen. Will that end and cancel the kind of confrontation? No. This, the trade war that we see involving tariffs and all of those Trump tweets, that is one front in a very broad battlefield of a great power contest that is only just kicking off.
Has it had the impact that everyone had thought it would have, and who has more to lose?
So it's been hard in some ways to see the impact so far, because in particular the American tariffs, they were very clever about choosing sort of intermediate goods that go into supply chains as opposed to final consumer goods. And you saw recently, I think it was telling that when Donald Trump initially said he was going to slap import tariffs on the stuff that Americans buy in the shops, for Christmas, the political risks of that became apparent so quickly that he then postponed those tariffs. So you can see that actually he can see political risks for sure. On the Chinese side, it's very hard to know what political sentiment is in China. It's a closed country, we can't do polling there. Anecdotally, the economic sentiment is bad in mainland China right now. Now, it was already bad before the trade war kicked off. I think at a minimum you can say that this has come along at precisely the wrong moment. That just as China was doing a bunch of stuff, in some ways for good reasons, they were trying to wean themselves off kind of boosting growth artificially with massive amounts of stimulus because that was becoming less and less effective. So China had decided it was going to allow a lower level of headline growth for very sound reasons. It's trying to manage all kinds of transitions to the next level of kind of manufacturing and development because it's done the easy stuff. It's built the airports and the high-speed rail and poured that concrete, and they need to get to the next level of rising up the value chain. And the trade war has now hit them at exactly that moment when they were trying to pull off that difficult transition. So I think that there is a lot more anxiety on the Chinese side than you see from that kind of serene kind of messaging from Beijing. And anecdotally, yeah, Chinese business is very jumpy, but it's not all about the trade war. It's also about just, soft sentiment in China.
So you mentioned that you thought there might be a political deal eventually that could potentially resolve the trade war, but could it go another level and could it potentially lead to a dangerous conflict? And when I say that, looking globally as well, I mean the implications for other countries that are falling in the domino effect in this trade war.
So I'll tell you something sobering, that it's very striking. For my job I used to be Washington Bureau Chief and I go back quite a bit still. When you talk to the people who are paid to do war games in the Pentagon or who are paid to think about where the next war might break out, and you ask them, could there be some sort of conflict between America and China, not a full-on world war involving nuclear weapons, but a shooting match, they're absolutely clear, yes, absolutely. Someone was telling me that when you're preparing a war game inside the Pentagon, you need to think up a realistic scenario of a war. That used to involve thinking, decades into the future, not now. That war game scenario could be very close. It could involve places like the South China Sea that are not really on a lot of American news, viewers' radar, but actually it's a place where the US Navy is kind of butting up against Chinese forces all the time.
Well, that's what we're bringing that back to the kind of this area, this region. What about Taiwan? Could the US go to war over Taiwan?
It's a really interesting question. So, of course, America is legally committed to at least think about assisting Taiwan if there were an invasion. Clearly, a nationalistic China that is in real trouble, there's a fear in America that they could see an interest in starting something in Taiwan. So you have an awful lot of people on the Washington side, counting amphibious landing ships to see if China is capable of actually taking out Taiwan. We have some fairly bumpy events coming up soon. I should say they don't think there are enough ships quite yet to launch a full-on invasion, but we have elections in Taiwan in January 2020, where you could see the re-election of President Tsai Ing-wen, who China regards as a very hostile, very dangerous force, although actually the truth is she's pretty moderate, I would say. I think it's tying into what's happening in Hong Kong here, because I think that the Taiwanese public is very clearly looking at the future of one country, two systems playing out here. And remember that one country, two systems was originally crafted as a promise to the people of Taiwan back in the 80s. That's where it comes from, was Deng Xiaoping, frankly a very visionary leader compared to China's leaders today, who realized that the Taiwanese were not going to accept just becoming another bit of China. So he came up with this idea of one country, two systems. The fact that that is under unprecedented strain here on the streets of Hong Kong is being watched very closely in Taiwan and will play into, even if it probably doesn't decide the Taiwanese elections, it plays into it. And that could trigger a whole bunch of geostrategic crises that America doesn't want to get involved in, but might have to.
David Rennie, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us too, and you can watch more conversations like this on Twitter. Follow us on #SRAsia. Thank you. See you next time.